This is probably one of those times where you're looking at the video title and are confused why I even bothered making it. Not because you don't think me of all people would be incapable of making a full-length video on it, but that there's not even a point to it. Well, believe it or not, I think enough interesting things about the various Xeno worlds can be gleaned from interrogating this question to actually talk about it in a full video format. And by the various Xeno worlds, I do in fact mean all of the Xeno games. So we're going to be talking about Gears and Saga here as well. In order to do so, I will involve spoilers for all of the Xenoblade games all the way through, and I'm going to try to keep plot spoilers for Gears and Saga as minimum as possible, but I am going to need to talk about important backstory details, like explaining the history of each world and the origins of various things, so that is going to spoil some revelations, though not what the characters in the present story do with that knowledge. Instead of just going in release order from Xenogears to Xenoblade 3 like I usually do, I'm actually going to go in order of simplest to most complex to comprehend instead, with simplest also implicitly meaning the closest to the canonical language just being contemporary casual 21st century standard English. And as such, the first game we're going to talk about is Xenoblade Chronicles 1. Yeah, I genuinely believe more characters in Xenoblade 1 are canonically speaking English than any other game in the series. And to explain that, we have to first go to the first low orbit station and what we know about that from games other than Xenoblade 1. We know the experiment took place in the 21st century on an Earth that was very similar to our own prior to the discovery of the conduit in Kenya near the turn of the millennium. We also know that the planet was governed by some sort of coalition government, at least superficially similar to that on Xenoblade X's Earth, that was comprised of many nations and most likely was a descendant of the UN. As such, and given the fact that the Radamanthus Authority and the Elysium Habitation Unit on the Radamanthus space station looked like they were administered by the United States, it's extremely likely the primary language of that coalition government was English. Also, Klaus and Galea were scientists. English is the language of science communication in the present day, so it's most likely that regardless of what the whole coalition government was using, the canonical language spoken in the room where the experiment took place was English. Now, I always see people automatically assume that Klaus was German just because his name was Klaus. He could be. He could be American. He could be British like his English voice actor. But ultimately, that doesn't matter when you get down to the base logic of everything. We don't know Klaus and Galea's nationalities or first languages, but that also means we don't know if they share a nationality or first language. So the only language we know they have in common canonically is English. This all matters because Klaus and Galea end up becoming gods and creating sentient life. We know as a fact that Zanza was the one to bestow intelligence upon the Telethia, turning them into Hyentia in the first place. Which means he directly put the sentience in them. They didn't evolve into becoming sentient. And I think we can also reason that Maynith did the same for the Machina. I think you could reasonably believe then that if they automatically bestowed intelligence on them, they would automatically bestow language on them as well, and that the language would most likely be one that God spoke in the prior world. Considering that all the people of Bionis and Mechanis speak the same language, it would suggest Zanza and Maynith picked the same Earth language to bestow on the peoples they created, and as I said, the only language we know Klaus and Galea had in common was English, meaning, yeah, everyone on Bionis and Mechanis probably speaks English. Now, they probably started out speaking English, but did that language evolve as society evolved, considering the history of life on Bionis and Mechanis is in the 5 digits? Normally, I would absolutely say yes. However, there is intelligent design. There's intelligent design specifically by Zanza around there, and we still have no idea how much of his talk about having reset life on Bionis multiple times in the past is true. So I think that even though he was not particularly pleased with what happened with the Hyentia, and I don't even know why he did the Homs after that, I think he at least had some sort of control to the point where they didn't really change the language they spoke a whole lot. And if my memory is correct, Napon and Xenoblade 1 are not said to have their own language, like they do in 2 and X, so that means that even they speak the same language as everyone else, which I would argue is canonically English. Alright, Now we can talk about X, which I'm sure is what you thought I was going to say first. And well, yeah, X has a lot over 1 in terms of just English being spoken, because we know as an explicit canon fact that many characters in X speak English. However, we also have explicit canon knowledge that there are some people in X who do not speak English, which, considering one has a single language regardless of whether or not it is English, does actually make that less complicated. So what is the deal with X? Well, that is the auto-translate feature of Planet Mira, which basically means that everyone on the planet is simply speaking their native language, but something about that planet is translating it so everyone also hears everyone speak in their native language. We know as a fact that Tatsu hears the humans speak in the Nopon language, and that it gets translated into very fluent Nopon because he complements the party members speaking. This also hilariously means that fluently spoken Nopon just gets translated into broken English for whatever reason. Either that or every Nopon on Mira is canonically speaking broken Nopon, so it gets translated into broken English. I don't know. There are some slight quirks in that, because some other races like the Prone also have their dialogue rendered in somewhat grammatically incorrect English, and people like the Manon have specific speaking quirks. Considering how every single alien race in the game comes from their own planet, that means that they are almost certainly all speaking different languages. Celica and Neilnail are speaking Clurian, the Manon are speaking Manon, the Orphi are speaking Orphi, and the Rothian are speaking Rothian. The only exceptions to this I can think of are anyone who's part of the Ganglion, because there has to be some sort of Samar Federation common tongue for everyone to speak when there isn't a planet auto-translating for them. My guess would be it's Luxar's native language, or whatever offshoot of the Samarian language Void was using when he created the Ganglion. I would guess that races enslaved by them, like the Prone and the Zarubagans, were initially speaking the Ganglion common tongue, but after being rescued by humanity, reverted back to their native language now that they weren't beholden to someone who spoke something different, but from the point of view of humanity, nothing would sound different because of the auto-translation. The only character we know as a fact to be speaking a language foreign to them is L. His dialogue sounds that way not because of a quirk in the auto-translation, but because he is canonically speaking English as a second language. Thankfully for the future of the White Whale 2 and everyone on board, it seems like the auto-translation was some kind of function of coming to Mira's universe in the first place, and not something the planet itself was actively doing, as everyone on the White Whale 2 is still able to understand each other regardless of origin, even after leaving the planet during Chapter 13. This is all well and good, but a question I want to bring up about X that I've never seen anyone ask before is whether or not every human is actually speaking English. Now, obviously, the White Whale was an American ship carrying a future version of an American city to a new world, and it literally has United States on the hull. Also, every sentient passenger on the ship barring Elma was a human from Earth. This, of course, doesn't mean the first language of everyone aboard was English. There are plenty of people in LA today who natively speak another language and learned English second, or don't really speak English at all. So, if the planet is auto-translating into a language people are familiar with, and someone's first language isn't English, will it translate the English humans are speaking into another language? Say someone on Mira's first language is Spanish, and though they do understand English and speak it fluently, they are still more comfortable with Spanish as it was their first language and the one they spoke at home growing up. Okay, well, if some human on Mira is speaking English to them, will they hear it as English or Spanish? And when they speak, will they be speaking in English because they know they're talking to someone who only knows English? Or will they just subconsciously be speaking in Spanish? We don't actually know. And the same holds true for any other character on Mira whose first language we don't know. Maurice Chausson is a very aggressively French name. Who knows whether or not that was his first language? Honestly, I've always headcanoned him as French-Canadian for whatever reason, so he is probably fluent in both English and French, but which language is he actively choosing to speak? I don't know. Kentaro Nagi, does he speak fluent Japanese? Was that his first language? I don't know. And this might actually explain a slight plot hole in not just XDE, but is only noticeable there. And that is the fact that basically every human has a very standard neutral North American accent in the English dub. Now, yes, this is a function of the casting and direction of said English dub, and does not necessarily reflect the way people are speaking canonically, even if it is canonically the same language they are speaking. But take someone like Liesel, who we know as a fact is German. This most likely means her native language is German, and she learned English at some point and is able to speak it fluently enough to get assigned to a United States ARC ship. Okay, fair enough. That's all completely reasonable, but she is still pretty likely to have at least some noticeable German accent, or use specific word choices or grammar quirks that indicate she learned English as a second language and that her first language is German, even though those languages are obviously very similar to each other. And she doesn't. So what if that's not because she just is completely flawless, fluent in English, or English was actually her first language and she grew up on a US military base in Germany or something, but what if subconsciously and without realizing it, she's actually speaking native German, which gets auto-translated into native-sounding English down to the accent? Alicia works as another example. We know as a fact she's from India, so yeah, it obviously makes sense she would have learned English at some point, but it is also likely that she's knowledgeable of, if not a native speaker of, at least one regional South Asian language. And just like with Liesl, she speaks English with a North American accent. Is it possible that she just spent most of her life in North America and picked up that accent from people around her? Absolutely, but we know she was working with the Indian government in India as an adult prior to the coalition days, so it is still more likely that she would have an Indian accent, which could be explained by her not speaking English, but whatever common language in India other than English she's fluent in, and that being translated into English for any monolingual English speakers who are listening to her. This is neat to think about, especially if you have your own OC or cross headcanon about their nationality and what languages they might have spoken before coming to Mira. But there's one very cool character-related thing that I want to bring up with respect to this, and that is the fact that I kind of lied before. Elle isn't strictly the only person speaking a language foreign to them, because Elma is not from Earth, but is also speaking English as she is disguised as a human throughout the entire main story. Now, she's an alien with mysterious alien Samar descendant powers, and she's been on Earth for almost 3 decades. So she's absolutely fluent in English, and most likely, as it is the first Earth language she learned, she speaks it with the native accent of wherever she spent most of her time, which would be the United States. So that makes perfect sense. She's also the last of her kind, so she probably barely spoke her original language after learning English in the first place. But I think it would be a neat character touch for her to, after revealing her true form and being accepted for who she is by her friends in Blade, she subconsciously switched to her birth tongue now that her alien heritage was out in the open and everyone knew who she was. Again, this would be imperceptible to anyone hearing it on Mira, but I think it would be a cool character touch to in some way have someone react to, maybe not necessarily her speaking as soon as she reveals herself or in her post-game affinity missions, but during her speech about her past in Chapter 13 Part 1, that someone notices that the way her voice sounds, it has an extra profundity or melancholy that it didn't have before, and that could be implied to be Elma speaking in her native language that maybe she has more command over and is able to express her emotions about losing her world in a more complete way than she could if she was just speaking English. And that is Xenoblade X handled. So we've got one world that is just explicitly humans from 21st century Earth, and another world that was explicitly created by humans from 21st century Earth. But what about characters that are far-flung descendants of spacefaring humans who left Earth a long time ago? Well, that is where we find Xenosaga and Xenogears. Of the two, Saga is definitely the less complicated one. There are no alien life forms whatsoever. The humans in Saga are just straight up humans who left Earth, which was lost after a time, and colonized other planets. By the time of Xenosaga, Earth has not been around for like 5,000 years. So while whatever language they are speaking is clearly a descendant from whatever the primary language was when humanity took to the stars, it is going to be so different that it would be completely incomprehensible to someone on Earth. Shakespeare, who lived only a bit over 400 years ago, is difficult to parse for a modern English speaker. Now, multiply the evolution of language by 12 times, and you'll get the amount of time that's passed between 21st century Earth and the time of Xenosaga. Now, in Saga, there is a galaxy federation comprised of most of the planets humanity has colonized, and that necessitates some sort of lingua franca spoken across wide swaths of space. There is also very accessible, faster-than-light communication and travel. So, despite humanity spreading across the galaxy, they are still very closely connected, which means that while language most certainly evolved, it isn't super likely that individual planets would develop their own language, even if they would develop their own culture to some degree. So it is still most likely that all of the humans in Saga did learn the same language growing up and speak the same language in the present day. Xenosaga Zohar was canonically discovered early in the 21st century, similar to the conduit in numbered Xenoblade, and humanity's expansion into space started not too long after, so it is likely that the language of the Galaxy Federation in Saga is a distant descendant of modern-day English, but it is so far evolved and removed that it has to be considered a different language entirely. Something that might be worth noting is that the interconnectedness of all things, collective unconscious shenanigans, and space travel might have slowed down the evolution of language, as it doesn't seem like language or culture has really changed too much in between Xenosaga Pied Piper and the main trilogy, which takes place a century later, especially considering there are many characters that appear in both time periods, but I think this is more likely a superfluous detail that wasn't included just as a slight concession for realism in order to make the story a lot more comprehensible, because if anything, the interconnectedness of the internet has caused English and human culture to advance much more rapidly than it did in the days before such things. There are also several times where a character will talk about old language from the Lost Jerusalem, i.e. Earth era, but usually that is said in the context of them reading a Bible verse that is implied to have been written in like Old Hebrew or Latin, so that doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the language they're speaking. But I have to point out, we are over twice as close to the first compiling of the New Testament as we are to the future year Xenosaga takes place in. This is real. Cleopatra lived closer to the present day than the building of the pyramid stuff, but on an even higher scale. As for Xenogears, most of the backstory is extremely similar, though still legally distinct, with the added quirk of the Zohar having specifically been discovered in 2001 for extra subtlety points. But the humans in that game are not direct descendants of the first starfaring Earthlings. Trying to avoid as many spoilers as possible, humans have lived on Xenogears' unnamed planet for 10,000 years following a spaceship landing on it, but the humans of the present day, as of the game taking place, are not direct descendants of the passengers of that ship. In true biblically referencing demiurgic fashion, Gears' humanity grew from a few people that were created by a powerful biocomputer on the ship that was tied to the Zohar's power, and since it's up in the air whether or not the only survivor of the crash had any biological children of their own, it seems to me that every human alive on Gears' planet during the game is a descendant of those first people. Now, of course, it is exceedingly likely that the first humans created by that computer were genetically identical to those that populated the ship, and considering the time between Zohar discovery and crash on the Xenogears planet is also about 5,000 years, they wouldn't be that genetically different from current-day modern humanity, barring whatever changes in bioengineering brought. And that also means the language programmed into those first humans being created on the planet was probably whatever language the biocomputer itself was programmed in, which, of course, would most likely be a future version of English, pretty similar to the Galactic Federation language in Saga, because a similar federation is implied to exist in Gears as well. This is, however, made more complex by the 10,000 year skip before Xenogears itself takes place, but not by that much, because the world is controlled by a shadow government that's been in power for most of those 10,000 years, lives in the sky, and specifically is manipulating all of the different nations on the surface and all that. There's probably some side dialogue or perfect works explanation that says something slightly to the contrary, but it does seem like the same language is spoken everywhere on the surface of Xenogears' planet, and that is most likely one that was engineered by the Sacred Empire of Solaris living in the sky. Now, Solaris does have its own language, and I would guess that Solarian is the original space English the first humans on the planet spoke, preserved as similarly as possible to 10,000 years ago as could realistically be done, and whatever language the people on the surface spoke is some sort of either conlang or corrupted version of that language after thousands of years of living apart from Solaris. So I think it is pretty likely that the surface language is also English adjacent, it's just more removed from English than the Solarian language is, which does put things one step more complicated than Saga had, even if the 10,000 years specifically doesn't really factor in that much. We only have Xenoblade 2 and 3 left, and since we need to talk about both 1 and 2 to get to 3, we're going to 2 first. And once again, we arrive at the eternal question: how much influence did Architect Klaus have over the evolution of sentient life in Allrest? Because yes, okay, Life started from core crystals, it makes sense that it eventually would evolve into sentient life forms resembling humanity. That's reasonable. But did Klaus influence that evolution, or did it just kind of happen, possibly accelerated because of core crystal cells? And basically, did he program language into the people of Alrest like Zanza did for the people of Bionis? I am still inclined to believe no, but I have recently made some compelling evidence to suggest that maybe he had a more active hand than he seems to initially imply. So, Alrest is probably the most realistic of all of the settings we've encountered so far, in the sense that it at least seems like every Titan, at least in the past, had their own language, and the common language being spoken is something similar to how Latin was in the medieval European world, where the liturgical language of the primary church is just what everyone who spoke different languages used to be mutually intelligible with people. So whatever that language is most likely the language being spoken by everyone during both Torna and the main game of Xenoblade 2. You could also somewhat argue, at least in terms of the main game, that it was some sort of common Ardanian language being spoken by everyone, but I still think whatever Indal was doing makes the most sense, and it makes sense for that to remain true over the 500 years because of Amalthus's tightening grip over the world, and there being less and less people in Alrest to begin with, so there's less and less places for languages to diverge at all in the first place. Honestly, I have to think Amalthus-era Indaline liturgical language is just what is still being spoken during the main game, especially because of Tantal. It makes sense for royals like Zeke and his father to have learned the common language of outside of Tantal Alrest, just because of their position under the thumb of the Praetorium, but you can also just go and talk to random citizens in Theoswar, and they'll be completely intelligible with you, no issues whatsoever, so it really does seem like the same language is being spoken across all the remaining Titans. I'm leaning in the church direction and not the trade direction because of what we know about the history of the Napon trade guilds, and all the stuff about Captain Napapon, which suggests that Napon used to have their own language that was different from the rest of humanity, but following the captain's guidance, they changed their language to one that is considered a cutesier version of the main human language, but still a distinct dialect from it. By the way, it makes sense for blades being awoken in any era to be able to automatically speak the language of whatever humans are around them, because of the way data gets transferred into the Aegis and then back into core crystals and all that. So it makes sense for every core crystal just be updated with whatever current dialect is. And if there was any linguistic shifts over the 5 centuries, people like Jin who did survive it all would be able to understand the language changes just by directly living through them all. And then we arrive at Xenoblade 3, and that is where things get interesting, because I think Xenoblade 1 people spoke modern English more or less, while Xenoblade 2 people spoke the same language as each other, but one that evolved independently of any old Earth languages on Alrest. So what language do they speak in Xenoblade 3? Well, we know that Alrest and Bionis were able to get into communication with each other long before the intersection, and there just is a cutscene of Nia and Melia speaking to each other with no linguistic issues whatsoever. So a common language existing between the two worlds was not an issue solved by Mobius taking control of everything in Ionios, or Origin auto-translating in a similar way to Mira. I've talked before about the nature of using light to communicate and being able to find mutual ground just by things the two worlds had in common, and whenever I did that, I touched on the fact that they both have access to Trinity processor cores. So my guess would be that whatever language they spoke would be the language the Trinity processors were coded in. And considering their origins, that is most likely contemporary English. So is it some weird twist of fate that because of influence of the Aegis and Klaus, the language in Alrest evolved into contemporary English, which matched the contemporary English Zanza and Mainith bestowed upon the people of Bionis and Mechanis with intelligent design? We don't know. Maybe Nia just learned English, and that's how she was able to communicate with Melia, and because of Mobius interference, everyone within Ionios just speaks English. But regardless, Mobius had to learn to speak somehow, and I'm going to assume that with the structure of Origin itself being based on the structure of the Ontos processor, they learned from the language that formed the structure of the Ontos processor, which had to be some kind of programming language, and obviously programming languages tend to be based on English. Plus, the Trinity processors were installed on top of the Radamanthus space elevator, the one that seemed to be administered by the United States, so English just makes the most sense all around for those. But also given how the initial personalities of the Trinity cores, including something resembling the version of Ontos that still exists in the present day, were raised in their own AI simulations, it's possible they synthesized their own universal Earth language based on their own simulations, and whatever languages were in their databases, that's what got transplanted both into the nascent Zanza and Maineth's brains and then got put in all the intelligent life they created, as well as being put into all the core crystals that seeded the Cloud Sea and created life in Allrest. So maybe there's no English in numbered Xenoblade at all, and it's just some sort of mutant future Trinity processor Esperanto that everyone in those games has been speaking the entire time. Except the Napon, of course. We still don't know about the Napon, and that hasn't changed in the month and change since I made that video on them. Until next time, though, this is Luxon, signing off.